The intake board at St. CCS Albert Memorial logged the arrival at 2047 in the morning, and the entry was clipped and dismissive. Unidentified male, exposure, possible head trauma, and below it, in a hand that had clearly been irritated, the words, accompanying animal, unauthorized. That single line would become the most contested sentence in the hospital's records by sunrise, but at the moment Dr. Raymond Holloway wrote it, he considered it nothing more than a nuisance to be processed and removed. He was 54 years old, 3 hours from the end of a 14-hour shift, and he had stopped pretending to be patient somewhere around midnight. When the automatic doors hissed open and a gust of January air carried the smell of wet asphalt and something animal into the bay, Holloway didn't even look up from the chart. He gave the order the way he gave all his orders that night, flatly, as if the answer had already been decided before anyone else could speak. Get the dog out, now. This is an emergency department, not a kennel. The animal in question stood beside the gurney as if bolted to the floor. It was an old German shepherd. Gray crept halfway up its muzzle, one ear notched at the tip and a long, pale scar tracing the line of its left shoulder where the fur had never fully grown back. Its ribs showed, its paws were cracked from cold pavement. By every visible measure, it was exactly what the night shift orderly muttered under his breath: a stray, a mutt, a problem. But Nurse Claire Bennett, 36 years old and 11 years into a career that had taught her to read the things people didn't say, was watching the dog instead of listening to the doctor. And what she saw didn't match the word stray at all. The animal wasn't cowering. It wasn't pacing or sniffing or doing any of the frantic, scattered things a lost dog does under fluorescent lights. It was sitting, squared, front paws aligned, weight balanced, head level, eyes locked on the unconscious man on the gurney with an attention so total it had the quality of a sentry standing post. When a tech moved too fast near the patient's IV line, the dog's gaze tracked the motion and then returned to the man's face. Threat assessed, threat dismissed, watch resumed. If you've ever stood in a room and felt that you were the only one noticing something everyone else was about to regret ignoring, stay with me, because that feeling is the whole story tonight. Claire stepped between the security guard and the dog before she had fully decided to do it. "He's not bothering anyone," she said. He followed the patient in. "Give me 2 minutes." The laughter started small. A junior resident named Petrowski snorted. A second nurse rolled her eyes. And Holloway, finally lifting his head, regarded Claire over the rim of his glasses with the specific tired contempt of a man who had decided long ago that compassion was a symptom of inexperience. 2 minutes, he repeated. For a flea-bitten shelter reject that wandered in off the interstate. Bennett, I have a man with a possible bleed in his skull. Are we triaging by sentiment now? I'm not asking you to triage it, Claire said quietly. I'm asking you to wait while I read it. The room number was Bay 4. The clock above it read 251. And for the next several minutes, while the trauma team worked the unconscious drifter, Claire did something no one else in that department thought to do. She read the dog the way she'd been trained to read a patient, by behavior, by detail, by the things the body confessed without permission. She crouched, slowly, keeping her hands visible. The shepherd's eyes flicked to her, measured her, and held, not aggression, evaluation. She noticed the way it didn't beg for contact, didn't lean in for comfort, didn't do anything a pet would do. She noticed the faded tattoo inside the right ear, the kind shelters don't use. She noticed that the scar on the shoulder was old and clean, surgical at the edges, not the ragged tear of a car or a fight. And she noticed the collar, not nylon, not store-bought, but a worn strip of military-grade webbing with a single empty D-ring where something official had once hung. "Where did you come from?" she murmured. The drifter on the gurney was no easier to read. Mid-40s maybe, a face weathered past its age. Beneath the grime, his forearms carried the kind of scarring that didn't come from accidents, and his hands, even unconscious, even slack, had the calloused, deliberate shape of a man who had spent years gripping things that mattered. There was a tattoo on his ribs the trauma team uncovered when they cut his jacket away, half obscured by an older burn, a trident, faded to the color of a bruise. Claire saw it. She didn't know yet what it meant, but the dog saw the man's chest exposed, and for the first time, the animal made a sound, low, almost subvocal, a thing more felt than heard. The crisis came at 3006. The drifter surged up from the gurney without warning, the way head trauma patients sometimes do, caught in a country no one else can see. He swung. He caught the resident across the jaw. Monitors screamed. A tray of instruments hit the floor in a bright crash, and two security guards lunged to pin him as he thrashed and shouted words that weren't quite words, fragments of command coordinates. A name repeated like a prayer. And the dog moved. It came off the floor in a single fluid line, no barking, no panic, placing its body between the man and the guards with a precision that froze the room. It didn't bite. It didn't snap. It planted itself across the patient's chest and locked its eyes on every approaching hand, and the message was unmistakable in any language. This one is mine, and you will not. Restrain that animal. Holloway barked, backing away. Get a pole! Get animal control! Get it off him! A guard reached for a catch pole. Claire shouted for everyone to stop. And in the middle of that chaos, a voice cut through from the doorway, dry, amused, and entirely out of place. You won't get a pole on him. The man in the doorway was new. Dr. Torway was new. Aaron Keller, a visiting trauma specialist consulting on a transfer case, leaned against the frame with his arms crossed and the half-smile of someone watching amateurs fumble something he understood in his bones. He had served 8 years as a Navy corpsman before medical school, 2 of them attached to a special operations unit, and he had recognized the dog's posture from across the bay before he'd even seen the trident. "Watch," Keller said. And then, almost as a joke, almost to prove a point to a room full of people who had laughed at a nurse, he spoke a word, short, guttural. A handler's command, the kind that never appears in any public manual, the kind whispered on operations and buried in classified files. The effect was instantaneous and total. The old shepherd dropped, not in fear, in discipline. It went flat to the floor in a controlled tactical down, body oriented toward the threat axis, ears forward, utterly still, awaiting the next instruction with a stillness that turned the entire emergency department to stone. The thrashing patient, hearing the same word swim up through his concussion, went slack against the guards and breathed one ragged syllable. Cobalt. Keller's smile died on his face. The clock read 3009. No one was laughing now. Petrowski stood with a hand pressed to his bruised jaw, staring. The second nurse had gone pale, and Holloway, the man who had ordered the animal thrown into the cold 3 times in 20 minutes, stood frozen with the realization climbing his spine that he had been wrong in a way that could not be walked back. "That command," Keller said slowly, lowering himself to one knee at careful distance from the dog, "I shouldn't even know it. I learned it once, on a deployment, from a handler who told me to forget I'd ever heard it." He looked at the trident on the patient's ribs, then at the empty D-ring on the dog's collar, then up at Claire. "This isn't a stray. This dog was trained for the teams." And he, a nod at the man on the gurney, "He's the reason." It was Claire who said the thing no one wanted to. "Then we need to make a call." The hospital had a protocol for unidentified veterans, buried so deep in the administrative handbook that the night supervisor had to wake a database administrator to find it. But the trident tattoo, once photographed and entered, moved the matter out of St. Albert's hands within the hour. By 4003, 2 men in civilian clothes that fit too well to be civilian had arrived from a base 90 minutes north, and the temperature of the entire department changed around them. They didn't introduce themselves with names, they identified themselves by knowing things. One of them looked at the dog crouched and spoke a string of soft commands, and the shepherd responded to each with a fluency that made the watching staff understand finally and completely what they had nearly thrown into a January parking lot. His designation was K9 Argo, the older handler said quietly, more to Claire than to anyone, because somehow he'd already understood who in the room had earned the right to hear it. He was assigned to a 4-man element that went dark on an operation we're not going to discuss. The official record listed the team as Lost. The dog was listed as KIA. He paused, and something moved behind his weathered face. "We buried an empty box for this animal 3 years ago. 3 years. Claire let the number settle. 3 years this dog had survived God knew where, and the man on the gurney, and him, she asked? The handler looked at the drifter for a long moment. Petty Officer First Class Daniel Reyes, teen leader. Also listed as Lost. He shook his head slowly. We don't know how either of them got back. We may never fully know. But I can tell you this, that dog didn't follow a stranger into this hospital. He's been following that man for 3 years. Through whatever happened out there, he never stopped standing his post. The words landed in the bay like a weight. Claire felt her throat tighten. Across the room, Holloway had sat down heavily in a chair, his glasses in his hand, looking older than he had at midnight. The handler turned to the dog. Argo had not moved from his position near Reyes, even with 2 of his own people in the room. The man knelt, lowered his voice to something almost tender, and gave the release command, the one that told a working dog the watch was over, that he could finally stand down. For a moment, the shepherd didn't obey. He looked at Reyes. He looked at the slow rise and fall of the man's chest, at the monitors that now showed a heartbeat holding steady, at the IV dripping warmth back into a body that had been freezing on a roadside an hour ago. And then, only when he was certain the man would keep breathing without him, the old dog let out a long breath and his body sagged, gaseous, and 3 years of standing post seemed to leave him all at once. He laid his graying head down on the edge of the gurney against the hand of the man he had refused to abandon, and he closed his eyes. Nobody in that room spoke for a long time. It was Claire who finally moved. She crossed the bay, knelt beside the exhausted animal, and rested one hand lightly on the scarred shoulder, the same shoulder Holloway had called the mark of a flea-bitten reject. Argo didn't flinch. He let her stay. "You knew," Keller said quietly, coming to stand near her. "Before any of us. You looked at a starving dog on a freezing night and you saw a soldier? How?" Claire didn't answer right away. She was thinking about her brother 10 years gone now, who had come home from his own war wearing a uniform that fit his body but not his eyes, and who had told her once, in the last good conversation they ever had, that the worst part wasn't the fear. It was that nobody back home could see what you were carrying, that you could stand in a bright, clean room full of safe people and be completely, perfectly alone with the things you'd survived. She had spent 11 years since then learning to see the people the bright, clean rooms overlooked. "I didn't know what he was," she said at last. "I just knew he was carrying something, and I've watched enough people get thrown away for being inconvenient." She looked up, and her gray-blue eyes were steady even though they were wet. "We almost did it again tonight." Holloway heard her. She hadn't aimed it at him, but he heard it, and to his credit, he didn't flinch from it. He rose, crossed the bay slowly, and stopped a respectful distance from the dog and the woman he had laughed at 3 hours earlier. "Nurse Bennett," he said. The contempt was gone from his voice. What was left was something heavier and more honest. "I owe you an apology, and I owe him one too." He looked down at Argo. "I've been doing this for 26 years. I told myself a long time ago that seeing patients as cases instead of people was the only way to survive the volume. That nurse, that drifter, that dog, they were all just throughput to me at 2 in the morning. He exhaled. "You read every one of them better than I did. I'd like to remember that." It wasn't a grand speech. It wasn't redemption with a bow on it. It was just one tired man admitting out loud, in front of the team he ran, that the person he dismissed had been the only one in the room doing the job right. In a hospital, that costs more than most people understand. Daniel Reyes did not wake fully that night. The bleed in his skull was real, and the surgery to relieve it took most of the early morning, and there were weeks of recovery still ahead of him that no one in Bay 4 could promise would end well. But he stabilized, and in a decision that broke roughly every regulation in the handbook, the supervising physician on the next shift, informed of the whole story, looked at the old shepherd refusing to leave the gurney and quietly arranged for Argo to remain in a corner of the recovery room, on a folded blanket within sight of the man he'd guarded across 3 lost years. The handler stayed in contact. Reyes had family, it turned out, a sister in Ohio who had spent 3 years lighting a candle for a brother the Navy had told her was gone. When she arrived 2 days later and saw the dog lying at her brother's side, she sank to the floor and wept in a way that had no bottom to it, and Argo, who had let no stranger touch him without permission, leaned his old gray head against her shoulder as if he had been waiting for exactly that. Claire was there for none of the grand parts. She had worked her shift and the one after that. That was the truth nobody puts in the viral version of these stories. That the people who notice, the people who stand between the dismissed and the people doing the dismissing, mostly just go home afterward and sleep badly and come back and do it again. There's no medal for reading a room correctly at 3 in the morning. But there was one small thing. A week later, a plain envelope arrived for her at the nurse's station, hand-delivered. Inside was no letter, just a photograph, old and creased, clearly carried for years. 4 men in gear, faces half-shadowed, somewhere hot and far away. And at the center of them, young and alert and whole, a German shepherd with both ears intact and no gray in his muzzle yet. On the back, in pencil, someone had written a single line years ago: "He never quits." Below it, in fresh ink, a different hand had added 4 words: "Thank you for seeing." Claire kept it in the breast pocket of her scrubs after that, behind her badge where she could feel it against her chest through the long shifts. She never told most of her co-workers what it was. Some things you carry quietly, the way the dog had carried his post, the way her brother had carried his war. The way everyone in every bright, clean room is carrying something the people around them will never see unless somebody bothers to look. That, in the end, was the whole lesson of the night, Saint. Albert Memorial laughed at a nurse and a dog. Not that heroes hide among us, though they do. Not that the dismissed are often the most extraordinary, though they are. The lesson was simpler and harder than that. It was that the act of truly seeing another living thing, refusing to look away from the inconvenient, the scarred, the easily mocked, is itself a kind of standing post. A watch you keep not because anyone will thank you, but because someone has to, and because the cost of everyone looking away is a man dying alone on a roadside with the only soul who never abandoned him being called astray. Argo lived another 14 months. He spent them in Ohio, in a yard with grass, at the foot of a bed where a man who had been declared dead slowly relearned how to be alive. When he finally lay down for the last time, he did it the same way he'd done everything, calmly, on his own terms, certain at last that his man was safe and his watch could end. They buried him with full honors. The empty box from 3 years before was finally laid to rest beside him, and someone made sure the marker carried his real name and his real designation and one final line, chosen by a nurse in a hospital 800 miles away who had been asked what it should say. It read, "He stood his post until someone finally saw him." If this story moved something in you, if it made you think of someone you've overlooked, or someone who once overlooked you, or the quiet one standing post that no one applauds, take a moment before you go. Sit with it. And if you believe the world needs more people willing to look twice at what everyone else dismisses, leave a word below for the ones who do. Stay a little longer with us next time. There's always someone in the room worth seeing.